My name is Ken Koontz, and I am not the usual tall, dark, and handsome Theatre TX Green that you're accustomed to here at Chocolate Box. I'm, of course, a reasonable, much less facsimile thereof. Tonight, I'm going to focus on the topic of suicide, which is a very serious issue that is seemingly gaining momentum in our neighborhoods, in our culture. And here to talk about it with us this evening is a young man who is an extremely competent and experienced expert in the field. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Tell me a little bit about your background.
So currently I am director of Soul Shop for Black Churches, which is a workshop that teaches faith leaders in the Black community how to talk about suicide and suicidal desperation in congregations, and really focus on several things that at any given time in a congregation, chances are you have someone who's struggling with suicidal desperation, either because they're thinking about suicide themselves, they're worried about somebody who's thinking about suicide, they may be a suicide attempt survivor themselves, or they may know someone, have lost someone to suicide. And so we teach churches how to talk about it. And I can get more into that as we go along because I'm the son of a preacher. Oh. And so this is near and dear to my heart. But I have been in the mental health space for over 30 years. I actually, for 6 years, ran the mental health hospital here in Charlotte, North Carolina for HM Health. Just recently served as the Director of the Division of Mental Health, Developmental Disabilities and Substance Abuse Services for the state of North Carolina, and then was actually the state's first Chief Health Equity Officer for a while. And I now currently do some consulting and contracting, a lot of it focusing on suicide awareness and suicide prevention.
Now, of course, suicide is a phrase or a term that a lot of people don't want to talk about, even though they may have had some experiences and so forth. So what is it and what is it not?
Yeah, I think you raise a good question, and it's the right time to be asking the question too, because actually July is Minority Mental Health Awareness Month, and so it's a good time for us to be having this conversation. It's a subject that really has been taboo in the Black community forever. Growing up as a Black man, black male growing up in rural North Carolina, grew up born and raised in eastern North Carolina, son of a preacher. Suicide was something we didn't talk about, and if we did talk about it, it was in the context that it was not a Black issue, that suicide was a white problem. And if we talked about it at all, it was really just to say if you died by suicide, you were going to hell. You couldn't make it into heaven. And so it's been something that we've just not really wanted to reflect on at all. Now, as a result of that, what we're seeing now in the Black community is a rise in suicide, sharp increase in suicide, especially among young people. In fact, the fastest rising demographic for suicide is in young Black males. We just recently, within the last few months, had data come out from the Centers for Disease Control that talked about the fact that a few years ago, 2018, 2019, as a country, we started, for the first time in decades, we started to see the suicide rates decrease, and we celebrated that we were finally making a dent in suicides. And of course, we've seen an uptick in suicides now as a result of a lot of the fear and uncertainty that accompanied the pandemic. But what we did not know at the time was when the suicide rates were going down in other communities, the rates were actually going up in the Black community. Black and Hispanic community, suicide rates were increasing. But we didn't talk about it because the focus in suicide prevention has not primarily been on the Black community. And so now we're starting to have much more of an awareness about the impact of suicide on the Black community. We're also starting to recognize the fact that we need culturally relevant resources in the Black community. That's part of the beauty of a program like Soul Shop. Soul Shop takes something that is already an existing resource in the Black community. We know that the church has always been the gateway to the Black community. It was where we were first socialized. Growing up is where I was socialized. It's where we've gone for our social services, when we needed help, financially or counseling. We would go to faith leaders. And data even shows that for people in the Black community, they're more likely to go to a faith leader with mental health challenges than they are to go to a psychiatrist or a psychologist. And so the more we can look at entities like the faith-based community and how do we incorporate that into our suicide prevention strategies, the better we're able to really impact and drill down into the Black community.
A lot of that faith-based community that you grew up with has kind of spread out now.
Yeah.
It's a much different footprint, a much different look now. In terms of how you approach those communities, what is it that you actually present? How do you actually present that, and especially when you got so many different?
Yeah, that's a great question. So a lot of it right now is still focusing on the traditional church settings, and so we're taking a kind of a multifaceted approach. So we still have a huge focus on the traditional church because the traditional church still wields a lot of power. You still see today that when politicians want to get elected, they want to go to the church. They want to take a picture with faith leaders. So there's still a lot of power there. The church is still also a way that we not only signal to people in our communities what's important to us, but it's how we signal to people outside of our community what's important to us. So there's still a role for the traditional church to play, and politically there's a lot of power still that faith leaders have. So we still see a lot of value in educating faith leaders on how to talk about it. And so we start with really how do we make it relevant to our faith leaders, because we still, for a lot of them, especially older faith leaders, still have this narrative in their head that suicide is a white problem. So part of what we do is we share the data, we share the stats that say, suicides are on the rise in the Black community. They are impacting our young folks. And then we talk about the fact that, like I was stating in the opening, that at any given time you have people that are impacted by suicide in different ways. Doesn't necessarily mean that they are themselves suicidal, right. But they may be impacted by somebody who's struggling, and helping them to understand that suicide itself is not a disease. It's the worst possible outcome of a combination of very complex things, and that often includes mental illness. But if it's a combination of those complex things, that means we have opportunities to intervene along the way. And so if we can teach faith leaders how to recognize people who are struggling emotionally and mentally, and then how to intervene and how to connect them with resources, then we can intersect a lot of that. But the bigger piece of that, I think to your point, is that we know that a lot of young people are no longer attending those traditional churches. Now, part of what we share with faith leaders too is there are reasons for that. People who attempt suicide generally are struggling with one of two things. They've either lost hope or they've lost connection. And if the church can't provide hope and connection, then the church has lost its way. And so part of what we want faith leaders to understand is part of the way you connect to them is you provide those resources that when they're struggling, they know they can come to the church to talk about it. But the other thing that we do is we try to work, we work with social media. We try to hit the places where young people are, where they're frequenting, and where they're getting their information from. So there's a huge social media component to it as well.
It's interesting that in virtually every negative category of census data, we'll find the African American community in a disproportionate number.
Yeah.
Tell me how those numbers have reflected and how they're reflecting now, because you mentioned that we're finding more and more of Black suicide. Is that a category that we, as you say, we've ignored in the past, and and now that as it is rising, do we find the general resources, especially through government and other agencies, providing adequate resources to assist and support organizations like yours to deal with it?
So I think there are a number of things that have occurred over the past few years. I mean, for one, there's a sensitivity to mental health now that didn't exist pre-COVID, because in large part, we were able to measure some things differently. One is we know there was a threefold increase in anxiety and depression across the board. The other thing that we recognized during COVID was we saw the disproportionate impact of COVID on Black and brown communities. We had to start to drill down into those disparities. At the time, when the pandemic was at its peak, I was actually working for the Department of Health and Human Services here in North Carolina, and a big part of my job as Chief Health Equity Officer was really looking at those disparities. And what we've always known in the Black community, but what became more apparent to the general public was that if you want to reach the Black community, you don't do so with your traditional means. You gotta talk to us.
Yeah.
And you can no longer expect us just to find ourselves in your resources. You got to give us resources that speak to our experience. So there's this now more of an understanding that providing access to services, whether it's healthcare services or mental health services, it's more than just physical proximity to traditional resources. It is about creating resources that are relatable to my life, to my lived experience, and resources that I'm willing to utilize. And so that's really shifted to where there's more of an emphasis on equity and looking at specifically across the board in healthcare how things resonate with Black and brown communities, and suicide has been a part of that. Now, there's been a heightened awareness about suicide in part because we see the numbers rising, but also because we see more athletes, more entertainers who are more outspoken about their mental health challenges. We see folks in the Black community like Taraji P. Henson and people like that who are talking about Charlamagne the God, that are talking more about mental health. And so that's kind of raised that awareness. So there is much more of an understanding and much more of a demand now from the Black community that you need to speak to us and speak to our needs, and especially that we see it impacting young people. Part of what's become more relevant too, and there's a lot of controversy around this because we're seeing so much pushback now politically around equity, but one of the things that's become more of a topic of conversation of late is the fact that if we don't address issues in the Black community that impact mental well-being, it impacts the total community, it impacts the nation as a whole. The same way that we realized during the pandemic, if we didn't reach into the Black community and the brown community and the Native American community, if we didn't reach into those communities to try to curb the increase of the COVID pandemic, we were not going to get out of the state that we were in as a whole.
Yeah. Speaking of COVID, seemingly a lot of areas want to blame whatever negative impacts those were. They want to blame COVID for everything now. But in the context of the suicide, how do you capture that and separate out the emotional side of it when you talk to not just a faith leader, but even one-on-one with the family that's had to deal with it?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think there's a couple of ways to look at that. One is, in some ways, it doesn't necessarily matter how they got to that point. Like when I'm talking to faith leaders, and we can get into things about theology, we can get into discussions about why that person got to where they are. Did they sin? Did they do something they shouldn't have done? And part of the way I deal with faith leaders when I talk to them is that the reality is you're about saving souls. But you can't save somebody's soul tomorrow if they're not here tomorrow. So let's focus on how we keep them here today. I think the thing that COVID did do for us is people were now better able to see themselves on that spectrum, because we realize how close any of us are to anxiety, how close any of us are to depression, because people began to see that as the fear and uncertainty of COVID heightened and as the social isolation of COVID heightened, that more and more people found themselves being stressed out, and more people found themselves feeling the symptoms of depression. What that has allowed us to talk about is that suicidal desperation, people who are experiencing severe depression and anxiety, is not necessarily because of a moral or spiritual weakness. And that's where I think some of the conversation has shifted, because people think about it differently now. It's not moral or spiritual weakness. It has to do with some chemical changes. It has to do with some life changes. It has to do with things that we experience differently now, that are impacting us differently now. So rather than looking at, well, if you just prayed more, or if you had more faith, you would be dealing with this, let's just focus on the fact that Christians, faith-filled folks, can experience anxiety and depression just like anybody else can. And the same way that you would tell a church mother who came to you that was experiencing diabetes or cancer, you would tell them to get medical treatment. We should be doing the same thing with people who are experiencing mental health challenges.
I have been shooting funerals, still photography, for the last 7 years, and one of the things over the last 2.5 to 3 years that I have personally experienced has been a tremendous uptick in youth suicide.
Yeah.
And kids that coming out of those experiences in those funerals and so forth, they seem at a loss in terms of you know they want to talk to somebody, but they're seemingly at a loss.
Yeah.
Talk to me a little bit about how you get to a person who's not come forward with it, but you know they're dealing with it.
Yeah. Well, yeah. First of all, in terms of the youth suicide numbers, we know they're on the increase, and especially in the Black community. We don't fully understand exactly why. One of the things that we do know, though, is Black suicides have always been underreported. And they're underreported for a number of reasons. One has been the stigma associated with suicide. We don't like to talk about it. The other thing, though, is that there's evidence that shows that oftentimes the suicides of Black youth and Black people in general are characterized as death by other means and not necessarily as death by suicide, in part because suicides are difficult oftentimes to categorize. And so sometimes the effort is not there. But in terms of how you get to folks like that, one of the things I always share with people is you got to normalize the conversation. You have to make it easier for people to have access to resources. You have to make it more safe for them to be able to come forward and talk about it without feeling like they're being judged or like they're going to be punished for it. I'll give you an example. I had a family member who came to me about 3 years ago. And this was a family member who we knew has had some problems with addiction. And in fact, this particular family member at the age of 16 was sentenced to 31 years in prison, sentenced as an adult, and actually ended up serving 15 years. And I won't go into his crime, but it was a horrifically violent crime. But what he shared with me when he called me up and he said, I'm in a bad spot. He said, I'm feeling like I want to kill myself, I don't want to be here anymore. But he also shared with me that he had attempted suicide 3 times in the past and had not talked to anybody in the family about it. Now, my father is a retired pastor. My father pastored 48 years. And my father's kind of the patriarch of the family. And so everybody goes to him with everything. And I actually asked him if he talked to my father about it. He said, I didn't talk to him because he wouldn't understand. But I'm talking to you because I know you talk about these things. I know you operate in this space, and I feel safe talking to you. And so I was able to get him connected to resources, but it was only because he felt comfortable with me that I wasn't going to judge him. Because keep in mind, by him being silent, and part of what he had learned when he was in prison was that he was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. And that when he committed this horrific crime, that he was experiencing a manic episode. And that was part of what fueled him to do what he did, to get into this violent rage. But he would much rather be perceived as a criminally violent person than a person who was mentally ill. And so that's the kind of stigma that we put on it. So a lot of it is, how do we create safe space, and especially for Black men, how do we create safe space for Black men to be able to open up and say, I'm hurting, I'm struggling emotionally, I'm struggling mentally, and not feel like they're going to be judged, not feel they're going to be shamed or ridiculed. And I say Black men in particular because part of the unique challenge of Black men is that more often than not, what is prized about us is physical. It's not our intellect, it's not our intelligence. We know that it exists. We know that we are smart, intelligent people, but people look at Black men more for our physical prowess and our physical things. And so when a Black man starts to open up about being emotionally vulnerable, we're oftentimes shamed and ridiculed, even among our own brothers. And so if we can create space, and especially for these young people who are looking for answers and looking to adults for answers, if we can create space for them to be able to open up and talk about what they're feeling, that's, I think, the one of what's going to end up being the biggest deterrent to youth suicide.
What about peer support groups?
Yeah, so peer support groups. I am a huge proponent of peer support groups, and especially people with lived experience. So we have here in North Carolina, and this is a thing that really interests me. We have what we call certified peer support specialists. Those are people that have lived mental health experience, oftentimes people who have been suicidal in the past, but they're trained and certified to be able to talk to and help and minister to other people who are going through the same things that they went through. Now here in North Carolina, we have some 4,000 certified peer specialists here in North Carolina, but we've got roughly 1,700 that are employed. So, and we talk about how, there's a deficit in the workforce for mental health, and we don't have enough mental health workers. We don't have enough psychiatrists, psychologists, and especially black psychiatrists, psychologists, and social workers. Statistically, only about 4% of psychologists in America are black. Only about 2% of psychiatrists are black. But we've got all these people out here with lived experience, even right here in our state, that we don't utilize because we have not figured out how to pay for it. We haven't figured out how to work it into our funding streams, and we don't value it the same way. So I am a huge proponent of peer services. The thing we have to be careful about with peers, and especially when we're talking about young people, is the misinformation. Because some of the worst misinformation I got growing up as a teenager, I got from my friends. And so again, if we can create safe space where they can come to people who have that understanding, that knowledge, to be able to talk with them, so not relying on their peers for information as much as they're relying on their peers for support. And I think we have to figure out how do we marry those things together.
Well, in the misinformation, when you're a teenager, a bulk of what you get outside of a book is misinformation. And trying to counter that misinformation must be one heck of a monumental task.
It is, but there are organizations out there now that really specialize in this youth space. Like there's an organization called the JED Foundation, JED. JED Foundation is all about teenage mental health. And so there are organizations out there now that really are squarely in that space. But I think it also goes back to the conversation we were having about the church. When I was growing up, as the pastor said it, that was it. That's the gospel. You mark that down. That's what you do. Young folks today don't think like that. You tell them something to do today, they want to test it out. They want to prove it. You see youth online with these online challenges where they're swallowing Tide Pods and all that kind of stuff because their friends told them to. But part of that is because we have given up that space of being trusted advisors because we still want to stay in that space of do what I say do, and let me tell you what, and let me tell you that don't do this because that's wrong, as opposed to tell me what's going on with you. Let me hear what's going on with you. I've got two boys at home. I got a 9-year-old and 11-year-old. I actually, my sons are 9, 11, and 30. That's a whole other story. We'll talk about that another time. But my two young boys at home now, I try to always give them space to talk about when they say, something happened, okay, tell me about it. Not immediately jump to, well, you shouldn't have done that, or you should have done this, but allow them to open up and be non-judgmental about what they're feeling. Same with bullying and things like that, because so many of the kids who end up in that suicidal space get there by bullying. They've experienced bullying, but they don't know what to do with it.
You think, you mentioned the bullying, and for the kid who's been bullied and does in fact end up either in mental health, but let's suggest he's suicidal, should bullying probably be a criminal act?
Well, in some ways, bullying is a criminal act. When we look at hate crimes, a lot of hate crimes essentially are bullying. So there are some scenarios where bullying is a criminal act. I think it gets difficult with kids because part of it is that a lot of the bullying takes place online. So there's cyberbullying, and the bullying looks different because, something that happened to me when I was 15 years old, there may be a handful of people who knew about it. And if I avoided a handful of people, and maybe I had to go beat up 2 of them, and then the rest of them would be quiet. But today, you can go online and it spreads like wildfire. And so it's different now. And then how you regulate that and how you determine whether there was a law that was broken or a crime that was committed, it's nuanced and it becomes very difficult. But I think a lot of the things that we don't think about as bullying today, there are some some things that are essentially bullying, and there are laws against a lot of it. I think the big thing though, again, for me is what do for young people, what do you do with it? When you're experiencing that kind of pain, because you know how it is when you are young, you want to belong. And more than anything else, you want to belong. You don't want to be an outcast. And when you find yourself feeling like you're on the outside looking in, and everybody else is talking about you, and everybody you see, they're snickering at you. At least that's how you perceive it. That's a lot for young people to experience. And then on top of that, for black kids, there's this constant reminder that we are viewed as less than. And our kids are seeing that. They're seeing the political, conversation, the political rhetoric. They're hearing the things that the media says. And so they see how people responded to Black Lives Matter and things like that. And so they internalize all that. And that impacts the mental well-being of black kids. And I believe in part that's why we're starting to see a lot more suicides, a lot more depression and anxiety among black kids.
Well, Victor, I certainly hope that your effort becomes a kind of like a snowball effect, that not only is just you, but others, and that if within the faith community that you are targeting, that it snowballs again.
Absolutely.
And gets more and more, because the result can be nothing more than positive.
Yes, sir.
And you seem to be on the right track.
Thank you, I appreciate that.
Applaud you for that.
Thank
well,
you.
now, thank you so much for
Thank
coming
you.
to be a part of our chocolate box. And one of the traditions of chocolate box is that you get to get a sample of the chocolate. Now, would you care to partake of one of these pieces of chocolate?
You know, I appreciate the effort, and I respect your chocolate, but I'm going to respectfully decline. You know, I'm trying to watch my figure, so I'm going to.
Well, I'm diabetic, so I ain't eating none either. Maybe
We'll leave more for the next one.
Yeah, we'll leave more for the next one, and maybe I can suggest to TX that maybe he'll have some popcorn or something next time.
You know, it's not called the popcorn box.
No, it's not. It's called a chocolate box. Well, they got sugar-free chocolate now, so
There you
we'll
go.
have some
Maybe
sugar-free
next time.
chocolate. Okay, well, thank you
Thank you.
so much for joining us, and thank all of you for joining us, and hopefully you will stay tuned for the next edition of the Chocolate Box. I'm Ken Koontz, sitting in for you.